McIntosh County, North Dakota, October 1907. The wind had a sharp edge to it, a promise of the iron winter to come. It scoured the stubble fields and sent legions of Russian thistle, the immigrant weed they called tumbleweed, cartwheeling across the prairie toward the gray horizon. Most homesteaders cursed them, kicking the brittle skeletons out of their fence lines and burning them in smoky, unsatisfying pyres. But Reinhold Pflugfelder was gathering them. He moved with a quiet economy, his wife Anneliese and their two young children, Jacob and Liesel, working alongside him. They weren't burning the thistle, they were building with it. On a slight rise on his claim, a frame of bent willow wands formed a low 12-foot dome, looking like the skeleton of some strange, slumbering beast. Into this frame, Reinhold was methodically packing and lashing hundreds of tumbleweeds, compressing their chaotic sprawl into a dense, bristling hide. Jebediah Kane and Silas Croft, neighbors whose claims bordered Pflugfelder's, stopped their wagon on the crude track that served as a road. They watched for a long time, their faces a mixture of pity and contempt. "He's building a house out of weeds, Silas," Kane said, loud enough for the wind to carry the words. "A bird's nest, a damned fool bird's nest." Silas Croft, a man who had built 3 soddies and 2 log cabins in his life, just shook his head slowly. "It's the prairie sickness. Seen it before. Breaks a man's mind. Come the first blizzard, they'll find what's left of him and his family frozen in that pile of kindling." The official judgment came a week later in the form of Vernon Pruitt, the county homestead inspector. Pruitt was a man who believed in right angles, milled lumber, and the solid, quantifiable value of purchased materials. He stood before the nearly finished dome, a ledger in his hand, and stared as if it were a personal insult. The structure was a hemisphere of tightly woven gray thistle, its entrance a low, dark hole that looked more like a badger's den than a human habitation. "Pflugfelder," Pruitt said, his voice flat with authority. "What do you call this?" Reinhold paused, a length of binder twine in his hand. "A house," he said. His English was deliberate, shaped by the soft vowels of his German mother tongue. "There are no saw logs, no glass, no foundation. I see no bill of lading for $50 of materials. The Homestead Act requires proof of improvement, of value added to the land. This is an accumulation of refuse. It has a value of $0. You can't prove up on a claim with a pile of weeds." Pruitt's tone was final. He made a note in his ledger. "This is foolishness. It won't stand till Christmas." Reinhold Pflugfelder simply looked at the inspector, then at the gray sky, and then back to the thistle in his hands. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, and went back to his lashing. The mockery of his neighbors and the dismissal of the law were just more wind on a windy plain. He had work to do. What did this Bessarabian thistle bundler, this immigrant from the flat, wind-blasted steppes of Ackerman, understand about trapped air and wind that the seasoned, practical homesteaders of the Dakota prairie had missed? If you stay with me for the next few minutes, I promise you will learn the surprising physics of why the lightest, most worthless plant on the plains could defeat its most brutal wind. This channel is dedicated to uncovering the lost wisdom of those who survived against all odds. To support that mission, please consider subscribing and hitting the like button, and let us know in the comments, what's the most unconventional building material you've ever seen used? Reinhold Pflugfelder was not a carpenter. He had never felled a tree to build a wall, never mortised a joint, never chinked a log. He was not a mason, familiar with the heft of fieldstone and the chemistry of lime mortar. He was a thistle bundler. In the old country, on the vast, treeless plains north of the Black Sea, his family had, for generations, managed the land by managing the thistle. They gathered it not as a nuisance, but as a resource. It was fuel for the bread ovens, bedding for the livestock, and, in the hands of a master, the raw material for the temporary winter shelters used by shepherds caught far from the village. His hands knew the spring and heft of dried vegetation, the way a bundle could be compressed to trap the air, the precise tension of twine needed to make a dozen brittle plants act as one solid block. His first winter in North Dakota, in a rented soddy near Weshek, had been a brutal education in the physics of cold. That was the winter that taught him his new home was far more merciless than the old. He and Annalise had arrived with high hopes, their 2 children small but sturdy. They brought with them their German diligence and a belief that hard work would be rewarded. The prairie rewarded them with a cold so profound it felt like a living entity. He didn't remember that winter in feelings, but in a series of stark physical facts. The crock of pickle brine Annalise kept in the pantry, a place that never froze back home, had skinned over with a half-inch of ice in just 3 hours. The blades of their new windmill, their proudest purchase, became welded to the gearbox by ice, in a single night of still, deep cold, the metal contracting so tightly it would not move again until the spring thaw. Most unnervingly, the sturdy parlor mantel clock, a wedding gift that had kept perfect time for a decade, began to lose time. The cold was thickening the lubricating oil on its escapement, slowing the swing of its pendulum. In 4 days, it ran 11 minutes slow. The cold was stealing time itself. He and Annalise spent that winter huddled around their small stove, feeding it precious wood and dried dung. Yet the chill never left. It radiated from the packed dirt walls and sifted through the roof. Their children, Jakob and Liesel, slept in their coats, their breath pluming in the air of the single room. Reinhold knew this was not survival. It was a slow defeat. He would not spend another winter as a victim of the cold. He would face it with the knowledge his father and grandfather had given him, the knowledge of the worthless weed. The problem wasn't the cold. The Dakota cold was a constant, a baseline reality. The problem was the houses. The conventional wisdom of the prairie offered 2 choices, the soddy or the log cabin. Both were failing his neighbors, and both, Reinhold understood, were based on a fundamental misunderstanding of heat. The soddy, built of prairie turf, seemed logical. The thick blocks of earth and roots were plentiful and cheap, but sod is dense. It contains a tremendous amount of moisture. As the temperature dropped, this trapped water would freeze, turning the walls into blocks of solid, cold-sucking ice. A soddy was a magnificent conductor of cold. Living in one was like sheltering inside a glacier. Furthermore, as the sod thawed and froze, it shifted and slumped, opening cracks for the wind to knife through. The log cabin, the aspiration of every successful homesteader, was better, but not by much. Jebediah Kane had spent 2 years building his cabin from cottonwood logs hauled 60 miles from the Missouri River breaks. It was his pride. With dovetailed corners and a real stone fireplace, yet on any day below zero, a delicate lacework of frost bloomed on the interior walls, tracing the patterns of the chinking. Kane was burning through a cord of wood every 10 days, an unsustainable rate. The problem was thermal mass versus insulation. A thick log feels solid, but wood is still a relatively poor insulator. It has an R value of about 1.4 per inch. Kane's 8-inch logs gave him a total wall R value of about 11. But worse, the logs acted as thermal bridges, conducting the cold from the outside straight into the cabin. The heat from his fireplace would warm the air, which would then rush to the cold log walls, shed its warmth, and fall to the floor as a new, cold draft. His family lived in a constant, invisible whirlwind of convective loops, their feet always cold, their heads too hot. Silas Croft's situation was even more precarious. His small cabin was poorly chinked, and the wind was his primary enemy. Air infiltration was a relentless thief of heat. On a windy night, the air in his cabin was completely replaced by frigid outside air every 20 minutes. He could feel the drafts on the back of his neck. He stuffed rags into the cracks, but it was hopeless. He was trying to heat the entire state of North Dakota. His wife's mood soured with the temperature, and their children were perpetually sick with coughs. This was the accepted reality of the prairie winter, a costly, losing battle against an enemy that never slept. In the late summer of 1907, as the tumbleweeds began to break from their roots and start their autumn journey, Reinhold began his work. He was not building from a plan on paper, but from a memory in his hands. The first step was the frame. He and Jacob walked the creek beds for miles, harvesting dozens of straight, supple willow wands, each about 2 inches thick at the base. Back at the claim, he drove the thick ends into the hard-baked earth in a perfect 12-foot circle, then bent and lashed the tips together at the apex, creating a strong, dome-shaped skeleton. It looked delicate, but its geometry gave it immense strength, each wand supporting its neighbors. Then came the gathering. The entire family worked for weeks. The wind was their ally, blowing the raw material directly to them. They would walk the fence lines, collecting the thistle balls that had piled up. They amassed a mountain of them, over 800 in total, a huge, light, scratchy pile that dwarfed the willow frame. Reinhold was particular. He chose only the largest, most intact specimens, those that had cured to a silvery gray and were light as air. The construction itself was a slow, methodical process of weaving and lashing. Starting at the base, he laid a course of tumbleweeds against the frame, their tangled branches facing outward, and compressed them tightly. Then, using binder twine, he lashed each plant to the willow wands and to each other, creating a dense, interlocking mat about 12 inches thick. He worked his way up in overlapping courses like shingles on a roof. Anneliese and Liesel would hand him the thistles, and Jacob would cut the twine. It was a family enterprise, silent and focused. His neighbors watched the slow, bizarre process with growing certainty that the German was mad. Jebediah Kane shouted over one afternoon, "You're building a fire hazard Flugfelder, one spark, and your family is cooked." Reinhold simply pointed to the 6-foot-long tunnel he was building for the entrance, constructed from sod blocks. No fire inside, only lantern. Cooking is outside. The final exterior layer was a careful arrangement of the largest, bushiest thistles, angled to shed water. The structure didn't look solid. It looked soft, almost breathing. It was a bristling gray hemisphere on the vast, flat land. Inside, the work was just as crucial. Reinhold stretched and stitched together several large sheets of oiled canvas, a material normally used for wagon covers. He meticulously attached this skin to the interior of the willow frame, creating a continuous, airtight barrier. This left a 12-inch gap between the canvas and the outside world, a space filled entirely with the compressed, static mass of tumbleweed. The floor was packed earth, covered with thick layers of prairie hay. The only entrance was the sod tunnel, which faced south, away from the prevailing winter winds. A heavy blanket served as the inner door, and a plug of sod sealed the outer entrance at night. It was during this final stage that Vernon Pruitt made his inspection. His objection was not about safety or engineering, but about economics. "I've reviewed the statutes," Pruitt declared, standing stiffly outside the sod tunnel. "An improvement must be of a substantial and valuable character. That means purchased materials, lumber, tar paper, nails. Something a man can tally on a bill of sale. Without a receipt for at least $50 in materials, I cannot in good conscience recommend to the land office that this patent be issued." This structure, by legal definition, has no value. Reinhold looked at the inspector, then at his wife and children standing nearby, their faces uncertain. He gestured to the dome. Is warm, is dry, is safe from wind. This has value, he said, his voice quiet but firm. He then turned and went back to fitting the final sod block on the tunnel. The argument was over. The prairie would be the only judge that mattered. To understand why Reinhold Pflugfelder's tumbleweed dome worked, you have to understand that heat's greatest enemy is not cold. It is movement. Heat is simply the energy of moving molecules. It escapes your house in three ways: conduction, convection, and radiation. The conventional cabins of his neighbors were vulnerable to all three. Reinhold's dome defeated them with a single, elegant principle: trapped air. The most effective insulator known to man is a vacuum. The second most effective is a gas that can't move. Still, trapped air is the principle behind every form of insulation we use today, from fiberglass bats to down feathers. Air itself is a poor conductor of heat, but if it's allowed to move, it becomes a powerful conveyor of heat through convection. A mass of warm air will rise, transfer its heat to a cold surface, and fall as it cools, creating a loop that constantly bleeds warmth. The trick is to stop that movement. This is what Reinhold knew from his ancestors. A Russian thistle plant is a miracle of structural engineering. It is almost entirely empty space. When a tumbleweed dries, it becomes a rigid, three-dimensional lattice of hollow stems and fine branches. It is about 75% void, or empty space. When hundreds of these plants are compressed together, they create millions of tiny, disconnected air pockets. The air within these pockets is trapped. It cannot circulate. It cannot form convective loops. It becomes a static, insulating blanket. Let's look at the numbers. The insulating property of a material is measured by its R value. A higher R value means better insulation. A solid log of cottonwood has an R value of about 1.4 per inch of thickness. A 12-inch log wall, which is exceptionally thick, would have an R value of about 17. By contrast, packed dried vegetable matter like straw or thistle has an R value of around 2.5 per inch. Reinhold's walls were 12 inches thick. That gave his humble dome an R value of 30. It was nearly twice as effective as a solid log wall and monumentally better than a leaky soddy. But the dome's genius didn't stop there. Its very shape was a weapon against the prairie wind. A square cabin presents a flat, broad face to the wind. The wind hits it and stops, creating a zone of high pressure on the windward side and a zone of suction on the leeward side. This pressure differential actively pulls air through every crack and joint in the walls. More importantly, it causes snow to drop out of the airstream and accumulate in massive drifts on the lee side of the building. Homesteaders constantly had to shovel out their homes and barns after a storm, with drifts sometimes burying their houses to the eaves. Reinhold's dome did the opposite. Its low, curved profile was aerodynamic. The wind didn't hit it. It flowed over and around it like water over a smooth stone. There was no flat surface to create a pressure zone, no sharp corners to create eddies. The wind accelerated as it passed over the dome, scouring the snow away rather than depositing it. While his neighbors would be buried, Reinhold's dome would keep itself clear. The south-facing, 6-foot-long entry tunnel acted as an airlock, ensuring that even when the door was opened, the ferocious wind could not blow directly inside. It was a system perfectly adapted to its environment, built from the very debris the environment provided. The winter of 1907 arrived not with a gentle dusting of snow, but with a roar. In the second week of January, a ground blizzard descended upon the northern plains. It began with the sky turning a strange, incandescent gray, the color of a steel file. Then the wind came, a steady freight train howl from the north that did not gust or waver, but simply blew. For 8 straight days, the wind held at a merciless 45 miles per hour, picking up the dry, granular snow from the fields and blasting it horizontally across the landscape. The temperature plunged to 31 degrees below zero and stayed there. Visibility dropped to the length of a man's arm. The world shrank to a screaming vortex of white. It wasn't a snowstorm. It was a river of ice particles flowing over the land, erasing roads, burying fences, and turning the prairie into a featureless white ocean. Every iron tool left outside became frost-blunted, the cold making the metal so brittle it would shatter like glass if struck. For Jebediah Kane, it was a nightmare. The wind found every minuscule gap in his cabin's chinking. A fine, smoke-like powder of snow began to sift into the room, coating every surface with a layer of icy dust. He and his wife stuffed the cracks with more rags, but it was like trying to dam a river with handkerchiefs. The fireplace roared, consuming wood at a terrifying pace. Yet the room remained brutally cold. They were losing. At Silas Croft's claim, the situation was desperate. The drift on the lee side of his cabin was already over the windows. He had to tunnel out his door just to check on his livestock. His single milk cow stood in the lean-to, shivering violently, her hide caked with frozen breath. He knew she wouldn't survive another night. Inside the Flugfelder dome, there was stillness. The terrifying roar of the wind was muffled by the 12 inches of packed thistle, reduced to a distant low hum, like the sound of the sea. There were no drafts. The air inside, warmed by a single kerosene lantern and the body heat of 4 people, was entirely still. The oiled canvas inner skin was doing its job, stopping any air movement. The temperature inside held at a steady 52 degrees Fahrenheit. It was not warm, but it was a world away from the lethal cold just a foot beyond the wall. Anneliese sat on a pallet of hay, calmly mending one of Jacob's socks. The children were playing a quiet game with carved wooden figures. Reinhold was methodically cleaning a harness strap. They were not just surviving. They were living. The cold had been defeated so completely that it had ceased to be a concern. That evening, for their meal, Anneliese brought out a small wooden bowl of cottage cheese curds she had made the day before. They ate it with dark bread. When they finished, a small amount was left in the bowl. She covered it with a cloth and set it on a low stool for breakfast. Outside, the blizzard howled. Inside, life went on. At sunrise, after a long, quiet night, Reinhold reached for the bowl. The curds were still soft, still spoonable. Every neighbor's clabbered cream, left in their pantries, was a solid white disc that had to be shaved with a paring knife. This was the proof. Vernon Pruitt was a man of regulations, and Reinhold Flugfelder's continued existence in a structure of zero legal value was an affront to his entire worldview. The blizzard had been raging for 5 days, but Pruitt's frustration had finally overcome his caution. He was going to drive out to the claim and serve the eviction notice himself. He filled the radiator of the county's Ford Model S with a bucket of hot water to get it started, bundled himself in every layer he owned, and set out. The drive was harrowing. The track was invisible, and he navigated by the faint outlines of fence posts. The Ford's engine complained, the cold making the oil thick as molasses. After 3 miles, he was halfway to the Flugfelder claim when a drift, hidden in the whiteout, blocked his path. He tried to back up, but the wheels spun uselessly. With a curse, he shut off the engine to save fuel while he thought. It was the last decision the car would make. In the 31-degree air, the hot engine block began to cool rapidly. The metal contracted, and the thin film of oil between the pistons and the cylinder walls congealed. The engine seized solid. It would not start again until spring. He was 3 miles from the claim, on foot, in a ground blizzard. Panic, cold and sharp, rose in his throat. Turning back was impossible. The wind was directly in his face. His only chance was to push forward. He pulled his hat down, wrapped his scarf over his face, and began to walk. The next hour was a descent into a special kind of hell. The wind tore at him, stealing his breath and driving ice crystals into his eyes. His goggles froze over. He was walking blind, navigating by the feel of the wind on his right cheek. The cold found its way through his coat, his boots, his gloves. His feet went numb first, then his hands. He could feel the skin on his exposed cheeks tightening, then losing all sensation. It was frostbite. He stumbled, fell, and crawled on hands and knees, driven by a primal fear of freezing solid on the empty plain. Just as his strength gave out, he saw it. A low, gray mound, almost invisible against the driving snow. Flugfelder's weed house. He didn't walk to it. He fell toward it, crawling the last 50 feet. He found the opening to the tunnel and clawed his way inside, pulling himself through the darkness until his hands met the heavy blanket that served as a door. He pushed it aside and tumbled into the interior. He expected to feel a frigid, miserable hovel, colder even than the wind. He expected the smell of fear and wood smoke. Instead, he was hit by a wave of impossible warmth. It wasn't heat. It was the complete absence of cold. The air was still and dry. He looked up and saw Reinhold Flugfelder staring down at him, his face calm, without triumph or surprise. Anneliese was there, her eyes wide with concern. Pruitt tried to speak, but his lips were frozen. He pointed to his face, his hands. Reinhold understood immediately. He helped Pruitt to a pallet, and Anneliese brought a basin of cool water, not hot, which would have damaged the tissue. She gently bathed his face and hands as the feeling began to return, first as a dull ache, then as an excruciating, burning pain. It was the pain of thawing, the pain of life returning to frozen flesh. As he lay there shivering, the agony slowly subsiding, he looked around the small space. He saw the children, safe and calm. He saw the lantern casting a gentle glow. He saw the quiet domesticity that he had just declared to be of zero value. And on the stool he saw the bowl of cottage cheese, a simple, mundane miracle. He had come to evict a fool. He had been rescued by a genius. The converting skeptic, looking at the woven dome of worthless weeds, finally understood. He looked at Reinhold and managed to speak, his voice a hoarse crackle. "You didn't build a house," Pruitt whispered, the words catching in his throat. "You built a lung for the prairie." Vernon Pruitt never served the eviction notice. When he was well enough to travel, Reinhold hitched his horse to a sled and took him back to town. Pruitt's report to the land office was a masterpiece of bureaucratic reversal. He noted that the dwelling of unconventional, locally sourced vegetative material had proven its substantial character under extreme weather duress, and recommended the patent be approved. He never spoke of his ordeal to anyone, but his conversion was total. Word of the Tumbleweed Dome and of the inspector's strange visit during the Great Blizzard spread through the Bessarabian German community. It wasn't gossip, it was vital information. That spring, at a ladies' aid sewing circle at the Friedenstahl Lutheran Church, Reinhold's brother-in-law, Friedrich Schmidt, gave a demonstration. He wasn't a great orator, but he brought a bundle of willow wands, a pile of thistle, and a ball of twine. With his big, capable hands, he showed the women and their husbands who had gathered to watch the lashing technique. He showed them how to compress the weeds, how to weave them into the frame, how to create the shingled effect. He answered their practical questions about durability, moisture, and pests. The idea took root. Nobody else built a tumbleweed house to live in. The log cabin was still the symbol of permanence and prosperity. But as a winter shed, a place to shelter a vulnerable calf or a flock of chickens from the killing cold, the idea was revolutionary. It cost nothing but labor. By the autumn of 1908, 14 farms in the area had a small gray dome standing near their barns. That winter, when the cold returned, calves that would have otherwise frozen were saved. Chickens kept laying. The humble, worthless weed became an integral part of their survival strategy. The knowledge had been transferred not by a book or a government bulletin, but from one pair of hands to another. The quiet genius of Reinhold Pflugfelder's design anticipated by more than half a century some of the most advanced principles of modern building science. His airtight inner membrane of oiled canvas is the direct ancestor of the air and vapor barriers, now mandatory in modern construction. His 12 inches of super insulation, achieving an R value of 30, meets the standards for walls in cold climates that builders only began adopting in the energy crisis of the 1970s. The dome's aerodynamic shape, designed to manage wind and snow load, is a core principle of environmental design, seen today in geodesic domes and structures built for extreme polar or mountain environments. He had created a passive house, a structure that maintained a livable temperature with almost no external energy input, using only the waste heat from its occupants and a single small lantern. He did it without engineering degrees or scientific instruments, using only inherited wisdom and materials everyone else threw away. There is a lesson in the Tumbleweed dome that transcends architecture. The American frontier was a place that rewarded results, not theories. The other homesteaders had brought with them a fixed idea of what a house should be. A heavy, rectangular fortress against nature, built of conquered trees. Their approach was one of conflict. They would fight the cold, burn more wood, and endure the drafts. Reinhold Pflugfelder brought a different understanding. He didn't seek to conquer the prairie. He sought to cooperate with it. He saw the wind not as an enemy, but as a delivery service, bringing him his materials for free. He saw the most despised weed, not as a nuisance, but as a vessel filled with the one thing that could defeat the cold: stillness. He didn't pay $1 for his house. He simply gathered what the wind already wanted to give back. He built his home not out of what he could take from the land, but from what the land was willing to discard. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found this exploration of historical engineering and survival valuable, please support our channel by liking this video and subscribing for more stories of forgotten wisdom. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized for narrative purposes. However, the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices and knowledge. Any application of these or similar techniques in a modern context should be done in accordance with current building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.